And we're back. This is the Catholic Lady, and we are reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. This book has been out of print for quite a number of years, and it's very difficult to find. But if you look hard enough and you check Amazon's resellers and eBay, you might just find yourself one. This one came from Amazon. So anyway, we are in the middle of chapter 18, and Aristo has just made his way to to Jerusalem to tell Saul that his father has passed away. The next day, Aristo hired a chariot and a driver from his host, who directed him to the street of the tent makers. It was in a very poor quarter, near the walls, and next to the street of the cheesemakers. And as goat's hair and cheese are pungent in odor, Aristo did not find the air delightful. Again, he was appalled at the queer habits and beliefs of the Jews. The sons of rich men, who chose to be rabbis or teachers, learned a humble trade, for they could not accept either money from their fathers or from those they taught. They had a revolting belief in the sanctity of bare labor and endless work, and despised the idle and the malingerer, though they freely give alms to the unfortunate. The narrow little street of the tent makers was very steep and roughly cobbled, though clean and barren, and each side was filled with tiny shops where the harsh goods could be purchased. Aristo saw the glow of small reddish lamps within, for little winter light reached this street, and he saw the bearded old men and youths in their shops, or saw them bustling about in the rear. They had an air of dedication, such as men who labor strenuously wear, and it depressed Aristo. What a people to believe in work for its own sake, as if hard labor was not to be despised, but to be cherished. Some came to the entry of their miserable little shops to stare at the expensive chariot that came rocking over the stones, for it was evident that few such came here to purchase this humblest of wares. They stared at Aristo in his rich cloak and hood, and his embroidered boots, and raised their eyebrows. When he halted at one shop and asked for the shop of Saul of Tarsus, astonishment overcame the bearded old proprietor. Saul? Saul? Saul of Tarshish? He muttered with incredulity. You wish Saul of Tarshish? The old man pointed at the lower end of the steep street. His shop is the smallest and the poorest. Master, if you desire better goods, I have them. So, thought Aristo with wryness, our Saul has not told these poor creatures that he is the son of the noblest families in Jerusalem. It is certainly like him, unfortunately. He has an afflicted eye, and his work is clumsy, wheedled the old man, hopefully. Now, master, if you will honor me, I will show you splendid goods. I am not buying, said Aristo with courtesy. I have come with news of the family of Saul of Tarsus. And he gestured to the contemptuous driver, and they rolled down the street. The old man watched his passage in new amazement. What family could that impatient and ill-favored and stricken and lonely young man possess, that one dressed like a king and in a gilded chariot should visit with him with news of that family? The old man ran inside to his grandsons to convey the gossip and to shake his head. I have heard, said the grandson, that he studies with the great Rabban Gamaliel. But the old man could not believe it. The last shop was indeed the meanest, smallest, and darkest of all. And Aristo looked into the recesses to see the tall loom and a busy figure seated before it. The Greek stood for a moment or two, observing and shaking his head. He had seen Saul but once in 11 years, on the occasion of Saul's visit to Tarsus 5 years before. And the change in the 27-year-old man appalled Aristo. He was thin to gauntness and bowed, and his red hair was long on his neck and shaggy. His strong profile like an eagle, his cheeks hollow, his mouth much sterner than before. He was very pale from lack of sun and too much work and study. Rolls of goat's hair cloth lay all about him, and the odor was repelling. His hands flew. His thoughts seemed far away. His garments were those of the poorest of men, and his sandals in this chill could not have warmed his feet, for they were made of rope. It was apparent that he disdained boots such as Aristo wore. One tiny lamp, flickering and smoldering, lighted the recess, and Aristo, knowing of Saul's afflicted eye, was alarmed. Saul, feeling himself observed, glanced up impatiently, and the two men stared at each other across the wooden counter that stood between them, also heaped with rolls of cloth. Saul blinked. He did not immediately recognize his old tutor, but he rose courteously and approached the counter. "May I serve you?" he asked, and it was the old powerful voice, full of hauteur and command, which Aristo remembered. The Greek was so moved and so dismayed that he could not answer, and Saul came nearer, blinking, and now the feeble light shone on those metallic blue eyes and red lashes and the virile nostrils. When Saul stopped abruptly, and a look of intense astonishment and disbelief rushed over his face, and he said, "Aristo? Aristo?" "Yes, it is I, Saul," said Aristo, and he pushed himself between the counter and the wall and entered the dreadful little shop. Saul watched him approach, and then with an awed and muffled cry, he flung himself into Aristo's extended arms and embraced him, and clung to him and tried to laugh, but the laugh was more of a dry sobbing. He rested his head on Aristo's shoulder, and Aristo held him close to his own body, and hated himself for the news he must convey. "Aristo, Aristo," Saul said in a choking voice, "how happy I am to see you." "And I to see you, my dear pupil," said Aristo. He was not an emotional man, but he struggled to prevent himself from weeping. Saul slowly lifted his head from Aristo's shoulder and stared up at his face and was silent, his brilliant and intelligent eyes searching. Then he said very quietly, "It is evil news you bring me." He had always had great intuition, and it was keener now. A spasm raced down his thin throat. "Tell me," he said, "you would not have come to Israel on a mere pleasant journey to visit me. Is it my father?" Aristo held him tightly by the arms. "It is so," he said. Saul released himself and went toward the rear of the shop. Slowly. He said without turning, "Come into my bedroom where I live, and let us sit down." He picked up a sharp knife, and Aristo was freshly alarmed, but he followed Saul to the rear, which was concealed by a length of goat's hair cloth. The room was tiny, and contained only a low pallet, 2 chairs, a table heaped with books, a small chest on which a lamp stood, and a tiny unlit brazier filled with ashes. Saul sat down on the floor. He slashed his poor garments in silence, and he reached into the brazier, removed a handful of ashes, and strewed them on his head. Then, without sound, though his lips moved, he rocked back and forth in the ancient movement of mourning. Aristo sat down in the gloom and misery, and now he could not refrain from tears. Not for Hillel ben Baruch, but for his son. He took his perfumed handkerchief from his sleeve, and the room was immediately filled with the scent of roses as Aristo wiped his eyes and cheeks and could not stop his tears. He was the noblest of men, said Aristo, the kindest, the gentlest, the most tender. Rejoice that he was your father. And Saul continued to rock back and forth on his buttocks, and slit places in his long gray tunic, showed thin arms and breast and thighs. And the ashes ran down his cheeks to mingle with his tears. And now the faintest wailing came from his lips in Hebrew. And though Aristo did not know the language well, he recognized the sound of grief and prayer. The room became darker and darker, and Saul was but a shadowy figure, and Aristo sat and waited and shivered in the chill for all his leather boots, his embroidered wool tunic and cloak. He looked about for wine, but there was none. The wailing rose and fell in measured cadences, mournful, even majestic, but terrible to the Greek's ear. Finally the Greek could endure it no longer. He knew that Saul had forgotten him, and that he could leave this place and his going would not be observed or noted. But Aristo could not bring himself, in spite of his own pain, to depart. Too, he had letters for the younger man. He said with sadness, Saul, Saul, I am here, your friend, your tutor, and you know my love for you, and I know your love for me. We are men. There are letters for you, and things you must do in spite of sorrow. You have a sister and kinsmen, and they must be told. It was dark now in the room. Saul stood up, bent low as an old man, and he went into the shop and brought a taper mutely to Aristo, and Aristo understood that he must light it at the lamp in the wood workshop, and then light this lamp on the chest. Sighing, he did so in silence. Saul had resumed his seat on the floor, and was again rocking back and forth. The wretched little lamp hardly lightened the room. But now Saul was looking up at Aristo, and he said in a hoarse voice, Tell me. However, Aristo himself could not speak, so he gave Saul Reb Isaac's letter, which he had written at Aristo's dictation. Saul bent forward and read it slowly. His father had been ill a long time, but had not desired his children to know or to be alarmed. He had died peacefully in the pond into which he had fallen during giddiness. He lay in the tomb beside his wife Deborah. He had not suffered, except from weakness. It was possible that he had fallen into the water because he had expired on the bridge. His son would say Kaddish for him on the Sabbath, of course, for 1 year. Reb Isaac spoke eloquently of Hillel's character and his nobility of soul. The old man sorrowed, not for Hillel, who now lay in the bosom of Abraham, but for his children. He was certain that he would not wish his children to grieve, but to rejoice that the long travail of living had ended for him, and delivered him to bliss and the vision of God. Blessed be his name. Truly, my son, the old man had written, your beloved father could all his life say with David, How amiable are your tabernacles, O Lord of hosts. My soul longs, even faints, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. Yes, the sparrow has found a house, and the swallow a nest. Blessed are they that dwell in your house. They will still be praising you. So your father lived, longing for his king and his God all the days of his loving life. And now he will sorrow and long no more, but rest in peace. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Saul muttered, The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Aristo compressed his lips. He would never understand these Jews. The gods afflicted, wherefore should they be praised? Prometheus was a nobler Titan than this. He defied the gods, and who should not? For was not the lot of man dark and desperate and ordained to suffering, his soul flickering out at the last like a little lamp in the eternal night? For this fate, then, this fate that moved poets to tears, should a man rejoice? He should rejoice only at the moment when he dies, for he is finally delivered from life, the evil fates having cut the cord of his existence and returned him to the nothingness from which he came. He said, Saul, you have duties, as I have remarked before. I have letters from your father's lawyers. You are a man of property and much wealth, my Saul, and you must consider what you must do. Saul rose. I go to the temple, he said, where I will pray for the repose of my father's soul. He stopped and looked at Aristo, and now his whole countenance appeared to shatter. Why did he not write me and call to me? Why did he not tell me? I would have flown to him at once. Oh, I am indeed afflicted, that I never looked upon my father's dying face and begged his blessing. Aristo sighed. My chariot stands without, he said. Saul bent his head and wept. No, I must walk. And he left the shop in his slashed garments, and with the ashes on his head, and that low wailing began again. And that is the end of chapter 19.